Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to Shaping Tomorrow, Season 10. I'm Shafiq Burhanuddin, fellow at IKIM. In this episode, we are pleased and humbled to have with us a scholar from the USA, whose name is Dr. Mariam Shebani. She is currently an assistant professor of Islamic thought at Brandeis University, USA. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Mariam.
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
How's your trip so far to Malaysia?
Alhamdulillah, beautiful. Always happy to be back here.
Alhamdulillah. You've been here several times already.
This is my third trip.
Your third trip to Malaysia. MashaAllah. Before we proceed, perhaps we'll introduce Dr. Mariam to our listeners and viewers. Dr. Mariam Shebani is an assistant professor of Islamic thought who is passionate about public education and community building. Prior to her current post at Brandeis University, USA, she was the Associate Academic Director and Head of Research at Cambridge Muslim College, United Kingdom. She received her PhD in Islamic thought from the University of Chicago and postdoctoral training at Harvard Law School. She has also taught at the University of Toronto, Harvard Divinity School, and the University of Chicago. Her research interests are in Islamic intellectual, religious, and social history, with a focus on the theory and practice of law, ethics, and Sufism. Her first book project, which is due to be published next year, hopefully, inshallah, is titled Islamic Legal Philosophy, Ibn Abdus Salam, and the Ethical Turn in Medieval Islamic Law, which examines how Muslim jurists from the 11th to 14th centuries address salient questions of legal philosophy and ethics, leading them to develop competing legal methodologies and visions of the law. This study centers on a prominent Damascene, or one from Damascus, who is an heir to this heir of Khorasani Shafi'ism, or Shafi'i school of thought, Izzuddin Abdul Salam, a pivotal figure in the development of Islamic legal philosophy, ethics, and legal maxims. Prior to her doctoral studies, Dr. Mariam earned a BA in Public Affairs and Policy Management and an MA in Legal Studies and a second MA in Islamic Thought. She has studied with Muslim scholars and conducted research in Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, North America, the UK, and West Africa. Now, in this first discussion with Dr. Mariam, we would like to learn more about her experiences studying our great ulama, the great Muslim luminaries of the past. But before we go there, perhaps we can learn more in terms, Dr. Mariam, your interest in studying Islam. We read in your profile that you have had this interest since you were very young, since you were 13 years old. But what could you tell us what perhaps triggered that interest? Because these days, 13 years old don't necessarily have that awareness yet. Mm-hmm. In your case, can you please share with us, Dr. Mariam?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that introduction and for having me as a guest on your show. So I was born and raised in Canada to a family from Egypt originally. And, growing up in Canada, when I was young, I wasn't very interested in kind of faith practice or kind of cultural attachment to my heritage. But something kind of got triggered when I was in my middle school years, 13 years old, an experience of being in community, being in a Muslim summer camp, and being around individuals and being in community, kind of living in a Muslim community for a week was somehow very transformative for me. And that piqued my curiosity, my interest in learning more and understanding better the religion and where I come from. And so that was a turning point, and that was a surprise also to my mother at the time, because I was probably the least interested of her children in learning Arabic or prayer or anything like that. So at that point, I wanted to learn more, and my solution was to drop out of middle school and go to Al-Azhar. That was my dream. And she very wisely told me there's many teachers here in Ottawa, Canada, where I was born and raised. First learn with them, and after that you can go to Al-Azhar. So alhamdulillah, I started a very intensive study in my teen years, and alhamdulillah, I had the time and the capacity then, and continued during my middle school years, my high school years, my college years, studying with local teachers in North America and eventually abroad. But I think it was really the many kind of questions that I had about, I'm very interested in how things work, why things are the way they are, trying to gain a better understanding for my own self.
Fantastic. And of course, as we learn that you this passion, this desire from you to continue learning the deen and the sciences continue for later on in your life, and subsequently to the extent that you travel to places like Jordan, Syria, Turkey, West Africa. Um, can you tell us perhaps what are some of the most memorable events or lessons that you've gained from these exposures, meeting scholars in those lands? And
Yeah,
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 Dr. Maria.
yeah. I think a few things. I think on the one hand, being able to study with like scholars that are like masters of their fields gave me a new appreciation for the value of like subject matter expertise, right?
Mm,
So especially in the West, there's many people who might be prominent in da'wah. They might have some knowledge, important efforts, but to really be with someone who's like a faqih,
mm,
someone who has like deep knowledge of fiqh or
mm,
deep knowledge of kalam, that they are really a master of that field,
mm,
and also what the fields themselves are, like how broad in terms of the oceans and the debates, the internal debates and the possibilities within each of the sciences, like how wide and expansive the fields are,
mm,
and how open also our scholars are to new ideas and to intellectual honesty and rigor,
mm,
and exchange and sharpening of arguments back and
mm,
forth,
mm,
and openness to other traditions, and comfort with ambiguity,
mm,
comfort with multiplicity,
mm,
not feeling like you have to have the one answer, like the one Islamic answer to
mm,
everything, which I think is for many, different reasons. One of the problems of our time is we think things have to be simple. There has to be one solution, or else there's a problem, right?
mm,
So being able to appreciate that openness, that mastery, and also a recognition of when you're with masters, they also know the boundaries of their expertise,
mm,
right? The other
mm,
problem we have is people who are, maybe trained in fiqh or trained in, in Quranic studies,
mm.
but then they're also giving fatawa,
Yeah,
right? Or they're
yeah,
giving mental health advice,
yeah,
right? Or they're
right.
giving even physical health advice.
Yes.
So I think the recognition of what is the limitations of my knowledge, and being able to appreciate mastery, and being able to also recognize where we have to turn matters over to other masters. So I think for me, that's probably intellectually the most meaningful lessons.
Right.
And then I would say, alongside that, also being with people who actually really embody that knowledge, I
Mm,
think
mm,
has been what is most transformative for me,
yeah,
not just knowledge in books and not just theoretical, but to
yeah.
actually see them be, reflections of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam
Sallallahu
in their
alaihi wasallam.
character. Ultimately, I think that's where much of the transformation lies, not just in
MashaAllah.
ideas.
Yeah, yeah, very, very interesting. Because someone like you from Canada, in this day of age, and going to these lands, of course, although of course now we are hearing more and more Muslims doing that from
Mhm.
the West, right?
Yeah.
And it shows the commitment. But I think some of the things you highlighted there, I mean, that itself is like the fact that knowing the limits of what you know,
Mhm.
that having this sense of mastery of the disciplines and embodying. This is basically what a lot of our Muslim luminaries of the past embodies, and whom you, among the things that you studied in your formal education in university, right? So on that note, I would like to learn more about your further studies in universities in America,
Mhm.
where you also furthered your studies in Islamic thought at the University of Chicago at the level of master's and PhD. Perhaps based on those experience, what were some of the things? I mean, of course, you studied many figures. I don't know. Maybe you could share with us some figures that you really struck you,
Mhm.
especially at the master's and PhD
Yeah.
level,
Yeah.
Dr. Mariam. Yeah.
Yeah. So, after studying my undergrad and my
Mm,
master's, and focusing really on the traditional sciences,
mm,
that was actually my primary goal. The
okay.
first degrees were just incidental; I had to do them,
Mm,
but the PhD was really not planned, and not
mm,
necessarily what I had intended.
okay.
But one of my main teachers at the time, he told me, at this point, you've done enough of the traditional studies. Continue with that, but
Mm,
bringing together the academic and the traditional is
excellent.
actually really important. And I
Yeah.
didn't actually believe that at the time,
Okay.
but alhamdulillah, like Allah really facilitated facilitated that, and the University of Chicago was a really good place for me at the time.
Mm.
So that I think was also important, and I do think in our time, wedding or bringing together the academic and the traditional is very important. Again, while knowing our limitations, an academic degree is not mufti training, and mufti training is not research capacity. So I think being able to do both is really helpful. But yeah, the program was very enlightening, and also giving me a historical context for a lot of the books that I had studied. I think is really important. In terms of some of the figures that I think left a lasting impression, of course the subject of my dissertation and my book project, Ibn Abd salam, I think a very interesting figure. He lives at a very difficult time when the community in Greater Syria was dealing with the Crusades on the one hand, the pending Mongol invasion, the loss of the caliphate, economic and social problems. So a lot of upheaval and tumultuous challenges.
I believe he emerged after the time of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi.
Exactly.
And he's like a product of the system that Salahuddin brought.
Absolutely. Damascus, in that, after the revival of Damascus under the Ayyubids, he was an heir to that tradition. So, living at this difficult time, but also the interesting thing is, even in these most, challenging times, they were still developing Islamic thought. Right, they were still writing and thinking, and developing new ideas and new ways of not just thinking about the tradition, but also of having the tradition respond to the challenges of their day. So it's incredible during the period of the Crusades and the Mongols. Like the intellectual production of that time is quite astounding. So I think he's an important figure, and choosing to do a dissertation or my primary research on one person, I think is really helpful as a student.
Sure.
Because it forces you to kind of build like an island that the entirety of the island. And from there, you can then move forward in history or move backwards in history. So I think it's a good choice as a student to do an intellectual biography, really focus on one person, learn to think like them, know what affected their thought, what shaped their biography. And then you can start thinking about other individuals in relation to them, and communities of thinkers as well. So I think that was an important stage as well in my training.
This is very interesting because I think I did read you wrote a review of another intellectual biography, I think by someone that Dr. Sohaira Al-Juwaini. And I think you wrote a very nice a review of it, what an intellectual biography is.
Absolutely.
And perhaps you could share a bit in terms of the significance or in today's context in academia, why such studies would be very fruitful, important for contemporary Muslim studies and Muslim thought, Dr. Mariam.
Yeah, I think in terms of the academic discussion, when you do intellectual history and through biography, then you have to account for everything else. You have to account for the economic, the political, the social. It brings all the different types of history together.
Interesting.
And it's kind of like one episode. You go deep into one episode, and then that enables you to also learn the skills and the tools and the sources for different types of histories. So that's, I think, as in training, that's useful. But I think also as Muslims, and today we often receive these ideas from the tradition in a vacuum, and they're disembodied from any context. So I think being able to see these ideas come from this figure who's part of this community or this network. Also the idea that ideas don't come from one person. Ibn Abd salam is an heir to multiple traditions. How did those traditions come to Damascus? What in Damascus in his lifetime is leading him to develop these ideas? What is it being used for? So I think if we can follow the trajectory of the development and application of new ideas, it enables us to also see, okay, this is the moment in Islamic tradition or history we're living in. What are the conditions that we're living in, and how can we gain inspiration from the development of thought in the past? So I think that was very helpful, also being able to understand, given the various sub-traditions we've inherited and we have access to now with, print and digital technologies, being able to think about, selectively knowing what is applicable and useful, and even what models are useful in that respect.
Very interesting. And I think this is one of the things that is commendable about academia in the West until today. And I think although now in places like University of Chicago there are more Muslims
Mhm.
teaching there as well. I think your own supervisor
Mhm.
is a Muslim,
Yep.
Dr. Ahmad Shamsi.
Mhm.
So I think there's a great deal of benefit even for Muslims who are in the West, who are
Mhm.
in Western academia,
Yep.
to look into this. So that's very interesting. Um, and I think also in the time in a time when I think a lot of perhaps previously scholarship on our own scholars are written by non-Muslims, by Orientalists, for
Mhm.
example. I
Mhm.
think it's time that we take charge, take ownership of
Mhm.
this, right,
Mhm.
and fulfilling an important fardu kifayah, I suppose,
Absolutely.
an obligation, so
Yeah.
that we can know our own luminaries, our own scholars from our own perspective, in
Mhm.
our own terms,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So yeah,
Yeah, I think, before I started the PhD, I had heard a lot of like scary stories about academia and how Muslims go in and they lose their faith and they come out, unsure about the authenticity of the sources and all these things. And I know that is true.
yeah.
I don't think it's untrue. But I do think that field itself has, I think the
Evolve,
field
yeah.
itself has advanced. I
Yeah.
think many Muslims are still thinking about hadith debates from like the 1970s with Shacht and Goldzier. The field itself has moved
Right.
beyond
Sure,
that, right?
sure, definitely.
And also I think we have to understand the conditions of those discussions as history and as historiography. So I think we just get really alarmed about nothing, in my opinion,
Okay.
about theories and ideas. So that's one thing. But also I think the field is much more open, and again, there's exceptions to everything, but I do think it's quite hospitable to Muslims in the US. And I do remember as a graduate student being told that like all but one department of Jewish studies in America has a chair that is Jewish. And I was like, that makes so much sense, right? And I'm like, then you look around the chairs of Islamic studies, and we had like one or two chairs that were Muslim. So definitely, Fard Kifaya wise, and this is not for everybody, but those who have the capacities and the interest, I think it behooves us to really be at the forefront of the study and the teaching to non-Muslims of Islam as well.
That's right.
In the West.
Yeah, and I was thinking, I think, if I may ask, did University of Chicago provide you any funds for you to do research, like travel?
Yeah. In the US,
Right.
essentially, you should never do a PhD unless it's fully funded.
Okay.
So all of the good schools, they give you, full funding
Fantastic.
for
Yeah.
all of the years
And
funding.
this is exactly among the things I think Malaysian government, Muslim governments in general, not only Malaysian, should I think try to exemplify. We tend to want to emulate the West in many respects, but sometimes I think some of the better features of the West deserves to be emulated also, especially on matters on knowledge, scholarship, education, like this.
And this is our tradition as well, like
Yeah.
patronage of knowledge and
Exactly.
scholarship, in order to attract the brightest minds, in
Yes.
order for them not to go into what
Yes.
today is the dominant fields of the STEM and so on.
Allah, okay. To Mariam, also you're also currently, I believe, embarking on a translation work of one of the great Muslim scholars, Al-Ghazali, and I believe they have commissioned you to translate a chapter on from the famous revival of the religious sciences, Ihya Ulumuddin, but particularly on that bab, on that kitab Al-Tawhid wa Tawakkul, on book 35. Can you perhaps share with us about this project?
Yeah. So the Imam Ghazali's Ihya, one of the most important works in our history, that continues to be very relevant and moving and efficacious in helping people to develop ethically and spiritually. So this particular chapter on Tawheed and Tawakkul, I actually I had a seminar at Harvard Divinity School, graduate seminar on Ghazali's thought. It was really fun to teach and to prepare. And most of the students couldn't read Arabic, so I had to have like English resources for most of what I was teaching. So I had offered them to study this chapter, and the translation that exists was very difficult and not very accurate.
Yeah.
And so I really was very sad, because this chapter, in fact, I think is one of the most important chapters in the Ihya. It's at the heart of a lot of what he's. It's chapter 35 of 40, towards the end, and it builds on a lot of concepts that he had kind of planted earlier in the book.
Right.
But the idea of Tawheed being so central to the faith, talking not just about what are the tenets of Tawheed and what do we believe in, but how do we make that experiential? How do we actually live in light of the fact that Allah is the only doer in the world? right?
Mm.
And what is the balance between having tawakkul and also being responsible and accountable for our actions? So
Mm.
he deals with a number of challenging, issues of free will and of
Yep.
even the more contentious issues of wahdatul wujud and what does it
Mm.
mean for
Mm.
God to be
Mm.
the
Mm.
only actor in the world. So very a lot of very very interesting moves that he makes in that book.
Okay.
Also contentious in his lifetime.
Right.
So
Right. Right.
the famous statement that laysa fil imkan abdar min makan, that there's the best, that the world as it is now is the best of all possible worlds.
Right.
There was a lot of debate in his lifetime, and since then, hundreds and hundreds of pages written about that one sentence. But there's just a lot in that book that I personally wanted to dive into for my own like learning, but also something that I think we all struggle with, this balance between acting and doing and then turning
Yes.
things over to Allah. So I think for me, I'm excited for myself to just be able to really dive into that, but I think also something that can be beneficial more widely.
Yeah, yeah, especially in today's deeply secularized mindset. I think,
Absolutely.
in fact, all of Ghazali's works remain relevant in that context. Also, Dr. Mariam, you are involved with a very interesting new project in Qatar. I think it's spearheaded or patronized by Sheikh Moza. Or she's like what's her title? If you could tell us, like her in Qatar.
Oh,
Sheikh Moza
I
is
don't actually know.
she's like the Queen Mother, I think, mother to
Her Royal
the Emir,
Highness.
Her Royal Highness, yeah, the Queen of Qatar maybe. But she started a very new project for women, Muslim women. So there's a Muslim women center as well as a mosque. It's a beautiful center. I believe, I'm sure you've been there.
I
Or not
actually
yet?
haven't, no.
Okay, but the project is called Al Mujadilah, and you're part of a particular research that this initiative have started. And your research is titled Archetypes of Womanhood, Models from the Quran and the Prophetic Community, which sounds very pertinent, especially when I read the abstract. It sounds like a very pertinent subject in today's context. But Dr. Mariam, tell us a bit about this.
Yes, for sure. I'd be happy to talk more about the research paper that I just recently started. But I think the larger point, and maybe we can talk more about that, about importance of like research collaborations across the world, right? So although I'm mostly based in the U.S., I've been working with the Islamic Law Blog at Harvard Law School for many years, which is meant to translate academic legal discourse for a wider audience. Working with Cambridge Muslim College in research, and now more recently with Mujadila. But I think the importance, and I know the important work you're doing here as well, of thought production, right? Research, but accessible research, I think is something the Ummah is now starting to do in different places. And I think being able to work together in different locations and different institutions is very important. So Mujadala recently, as you mentioned, launched, I think, in the fall. So my work with them has been some research strategy on the first hand, and now part of this research group on stewardship as well. So my paper for that group is on archetypes of womanhood.
Yep.
And so the idea really is when we, at least the discourse I grew up with in the 1990s about womanhood was like very much about the ideal Muslim woman. There's one model, you tick off certain boxes and you're an ideal Muslim woman. If you don't tick them off, then I guess implication is you're not ideal. So I think what we learn from our tradition, both in the Quran, the Quranic models that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Daraballahu mathalan lilladhina amanu, that God says that He has given as parables or as models, right, amthal, for the believers, not just for the believing women, but the believing men as well. That these are the women of the Quran, of Maryam alayhi salam, of Asya alayhi salam, of Bilqis, and so on. And if you look at them and you look at their lives and their trajectories and what we can intuit about their personalities, even very different women, some are married, some have children, some have difficult abusive relationships, some don't have married relationships. And I think what we're looking for is what are the lessons from that, right? What are the lessons that Allah is drawing for women broadly, and what are the things that tie them together in terms of piety, in terms of devotion, in terms of courage, right? The courage of the Quranic women is incredible. So thinking about, on the one hand, the models with an S, multiple models in the Quran, and then even closer, and maybe we have more detail about, are the wives of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, And I was really struck about, in his lifetime, you can already see they're very different, but that becomes much more magnified after he passes away. So they had, radically different understandings of what their role was in the community after he passed, right? So Sauda, for example, even when Uthman organized a Hajj for all of the women, all of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, from Medina to Mecca under the supervision of the Caliph, she refused to go. She said, the ayah is remain in your homes. I'm not going for Hajj.
Okay.
And then you have Aisha, who's leading an army and teaching and, guiding the community. And there was even tension among them about their roles, Salama and Aisha being more public, the others being more private. So the point is, there is mutual acceptance of different models, of different ways of being, of different roles in the community. And they had different understanding. And I think today, that's really important for Muslim women to be able to say, I'm an academic, I'm a stay-at-home mother, I'm in industry, I'm, working in the mosque, whatever it might be, but also live and let live, being able to be comfortable with all of that being okay. There is no one ideal for Muslim women.
Sure.
I think is very important and very liberating for us. And also, Muslim women go through many stages in life. And maybe you're more like Aisha when you're young, and you're more like Sauda when and that's all fine, right? The point is there's possibilities, and Allah's giving us multiple models. I think is very important for us in our own devotion to Allah, and us as communities of women also to understand and to appreciate and not be falling into kind of like mutual judgment in a negative way.
I think this is a very pertinent and important research, Dr. Mariam, because I think it in a way it would help many to understand the study of ethics as well, ilmu akhlaq, right? Because, for example, when you talk about the virtues, sometimes it can be quite theoretical and abstract. How do you acquire those virtues? And in fact, I think the ulama, the scholars have discussed the fact that when you want to acquire a certain virtue at a certain age and at a later age could be different. The justice for someone before they're married is different compared to someone who's married, for example. So I think with the kind of your research, I think it would definitely, like you say, it would be very liberating for women, as well as it would be very powerful reference or resource for their own for education in general. I think, So,
and I think stories and models are always very accessible and very something you can connect to easily. You're memorable, and that's the Quranic ethos as well. Stories, lessons, for us to reflect upon. So inshallah, it's useful.
Of course, we are not doing justice at all to Dr. Mariam with the range of interest that she has, and her expertise and her insights. But at least perhaps before we conclude this particular episode, we would like to just to learn more. What do you plan to do in terms of studying Muslim luminaries, in terms of future? What are your hopes, your plans, and perhaps what you hope that others would perhaps consider venturing into if they are able to? Because I think it's very important that there are more Muslim women as well following your kind of direction and charting the path of scholarship, I think, in today's day of age, So, but what are your thoughts in terms of what you'd like to do more in the future, Dr. Mariam?
I think because my first kind of focus for the last 10 years has been on the medieval Ayyubid 12th, 13th century, like the middle period of Islam, as we call it. I think I'm really drawn to looking on the one hand at the early period. So part of that, like the seerah of the Prophet, the hadith, some of the early developments in law and ethics in the early period, but also I'm very drawn to like 20th century contemporary thought. I think once you really get a good sense of the tradition, then the questions become not just contemporary, but even modern Islamic thought. What are the things? I think I have a different perspective on that difficult, like that long, 19th century, 20th century, what it meant to, looking at the decisions that had to be made, the concessions that had to be made, the attempts that were made at retaining certain things, at reforming certain things, I think is a really interesting history. And I think it's important to understand that, to understand what the 21st century is about as well. So more, inshallah, contemporary Islamic thought as well.
MashaAllah. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been honored to have with us Dr. Mariam Shaybani. She's currently an assistant professor of Islamic thought at Brandeis University, USA, currently visiting in Malaysia, discussing with us on the topic of studying Muslim luminaries of the past. Inshallah, we hope to have another episode with her to learn more from her experience and insights. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you
Mariam.
very much. Thank you.
With that, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi